Hi, it's Emily Freitag with Instruction Partners, and I'm so glad to be joined today by John King, CEO of EdTrust and former Secretary of Education, to talk about rethinking intervention. And we are centering on this question of what do we know about what works to accelerate student learning, and what do we know doesn't work as we seek to find a path forward to serve students in their recovery from COVID. John, wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for taking time. And we're asking everyone to just start with their personal story because that obviously anchors our understanding of learning in so many ways. So please tell us about your learning journey and what that informs for you as you think about what it takes to accelerate learning for students.
Sure. Now, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you. So I began my education in New York City, where I grew up. Both my parents were New York City public school teachers. And so we always talked about school a lot at home growing up. Mm-hmm. But my parents couldn't have known the difference that New York City schools would end up making in my life. When I was 8, in October of my 4th grade year, my mom passed away. And after that, I lived with my dad. My dad was quite sick with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. So home was this place that was scary and inconsistent and unstable. But school was amazing. I had a teacher in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, Mr. Osterweil, who saved my life. His classroom was safe and nurturing and supportive. And it was also incredibly academically rigorous and engaging. We read the New York Times every day, 4th, 5th, 6th grade. We did productions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare in elementary school. We did production of Alice in Wonderland. We went to the ballet and to the museum. We were exposed to a whole world beyond Canarsie, Brooklyn. And those experiences at PS 276 shaped my life profoundly, and also how I think about schools. And I really became a teacher because of the difference that Mr. Osterweil made in my life during that really difficult period. And after I left his classroom, my dad was quite sick at that point, and my dad passed when I was 12. And I ended up moving around different family members, different schools, but it was always teachers that gave me a sense of hope and purpose. But it also wasn't a straight line. I always, say to folks, I'm the first U.S. Secretary of Education who have been kicked out of high school. And, like many kids who experience trauma at early ages, I was really angry as a teenager. I was angry at adults, angry at my parents. Maybe that's irrational, but I was angry at the world. And I struggled. And again, after I got kicked out, it was teachers and a school counselor who gave me a second chance, who were willing to see me as more than the sum of my mistakes. And that was critical to my life trajectory as well. And also has shaped how I think about the centrality of relationships to school and giving students a sense of purpose and hope when they may not have that on their own.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. What did you love learning about in school? Did you have particular subjects of passion?
Yeah. Well, I was a social studies teacher, so it's probably not surprising that I loved social studies. I loved learning about the world and world leaders and current events. I loved learning about history. Loved learning about the founding period. Loved learning about Reconstruction. I've always been really interested in how America has evolved and the tensions between sort of our founding values and the reality of falling quite far short of the promise of equality and that tension throughout our history. So I've always loved that. Always loved reading and literature. But I guess I'd say more broadly, I loved school. I'm always loved school as a place that was safe and supportive.
And it sounds in your story like you loved the place of school, which is just so interesting in this time where school is not place-based in the same way. Thank you for sharing that. So now take us to a broader view. You've had so many different experiences in education at every single level of our system. Across your experience, the research that you see and do at EdTrust, what do we know matters in the work of accelerating student learning? What works?
Yeah. Well, it's worth saying at the outset that the core of education in my mind is the relationship between teacher and the student and the work in which they're engaged. Right? That's the heart of the matter. And so
very Elmore, yeah.
Right. So the preparation of teachers and their training and their success in building relationships with students and engaging students is foundational. And then the work matters a lot. And we know from the evidence that there is a science to teaching reading. So we ought to see that reflected in the curriculum. We know from evidence that students are going to be more successful in college and careers if they have lots of opportunity to write throughout their educational experience. So we should have students writing. We know that students will need skills around research. And so we ought to develop that in our curriculum. So in many ways, the quality of the curriculum, the quality of the assignments is something we know a lot about what they should look like. And yet, in many places, we are not able to execute at the level that we should. So if we get the relationship right and the curriculum right, we're off to a great start. We need more evidence. We don't have as strong an evidence base around effective instruction, let's say in science and social studies. We certainly don't have the level of RCT evidence that we have around reading and math. We know a fair amount about sort of the socio-emotional learning environment. We have less evidence around the specific practices and programs that are necessary to achieve that positive socio-emotional environment, although we have some. We have good evidence around the power of tutoring and intensive work to support students in closing academic gaps that they may have. We have good evidence around the power of accelerating learning, giving students access to advanced coursework, making sure that the work that they're doing is pushing their academic skills forward as opposed to dropping down the rigor level as soon as you see students struggling. Instead, what we should be doing is providing challenging work with support. So we do know a fair amount. We have a lot of evidence that strong teachers and strong principals matter. Less systematic evidence around what good teacher development and principal development look like. So you can't necessarily go to the What Works Clearinghouse, where the U.S. Education Department gathers evidence, and find incredibly impressive results for professional development programming. And so that's a real weakness in our field, I think, a place where we need to do a lot more evidence building.
And you touched a little bit, but can you get as specific as you can about what we know does not work?
Yeah, well, I'll give you two examples. There are folks who philosophically are unwilling to incorporate the teaching of phonics into reading instruction, and the science is quite clear on this. If you do not do systematic phonics instruction within a reading program, not as the whole reading program, but within the reading program, you are going to have students who never learn to decode. Some students will do it on their own, but many will not. You know, I think about the great work that Emily Hanford has done, sort of gathering the immense research evidence on this point. So we know a good reading instruction program for the early grades is going to include systematic phonics instruction alongside lots of exposure to reading, lots of building of fluency, hearing text read aloud, building vocabulary. And we also know that knowledge building is critical to success in reading. We know that if students don't learn science and social studies, they don't build their vocabulary, if they aren't exposed to arts, if they aren't exposed to geography and the world around them, then they may be able to decode the words, but they won't be able to make meaning of them. And so we've got to do systematic content knowledge building. And to the extent that schools abandon science and social studies in favor of more drills that look like the state tests in reading, they are making a mistake, a pedagogical mistake. Students need content knowledge building if they're going to be strong readers.
One other thing we've been exploring a little bit are the metaphors and mental models that we may carry as educators about how to help a student with unfinished learning. And so, you know, you see if you Google metaphors for learning, you get a really interesting array, but many seem to hinge on this idea of a sequential nature of learning. Like if you don't have something, you go back, you pick up. We have to diagnose so we can pinpoint where kids are and then pick up. Help us make sense of like whether those seem to be true, whether they're not, other metaphors or mental models that you think would be better as we think about the task of supporting students who are going to have missed a great deal of time in school.
Yeah, well, this is one of the reasons that I think careful planning and time for careful planning is going to be so critical for next school year, because there's a danger in the sequential model that students never get exposed to grade level work. They never get exposed to rigorous content because you sort of are in a downward spiral where you keep trying to go lower to provide something that students will be able to master, and so then they're not exposed to the kind of content that will actually push their learning forward. So there's a danger to the sequential model, but it is also a danger to behave as though those gaps that students have don't matter, and that you can sort of get them to succeed with grade level work without ever addressing those gaps, right? And so there's this balance that is needed. I'm not sure what the right metaphor is for it, but it's certainly something I think that we know from the evidence that we have to blend a strategy of exposing students to rigorous, grade appropriate work and addressing those gaps. I think about what we're learning in the higher ed space around co-requisite courses, that just having entering freshmen going to remedial courses is quite bad. It sends a signal that college is not for them. Remedial courses are often ineffective. They don't help students get credits that get them closer to graduation. They're expensive for the student because they're spending money, but it's not actually getting them credits they need to graduate. Remediation hasn't worked. Just placing a student in a course where they're unprepared and not able to do the work, that also is unlikely to work. But a good co-requisite strategy where students are engaging in credit-bearing coursework, but also getting additional support tutoring, small group work, where the curriculum is intentionally designed to cover and address some of the gaps they may have. That has a lot of promise for getting better outcomes at the higher end level. And I think there are some lessons there for K-12 as we think about how we make up for this incredible learning loss that we're going to see from COVID-19.
We're talking to a number of folks on the higher ed side across this series as well. Thank you for bringing that in. Last question, equity. So how do we operate effectively as educators with an understanding of the true definition of equity, which is about giving, which doesn't mean equality, right? We're not giving every student the same, but really giving the students who need more. What could that look like as we think to the next couple of years, and how do we operate with a mindset of commitment to true equity?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the keys is that we have to start by figuring out what is needed by the students who are most vulnerable. And if we address their needs, the students who are affluent students with lots of privilege, they're going to be fine. But instead, what we do in many places is we start with the student who has very few obstacles, and then someone in the meeting has to say, oh, but what about English learners? What about students with disabilities? What about kids who don't have internet access? And then we end up backing into our strategies to address equity rather than putting equity at the center. So if you put equity at the center, over the next few months, we have got to close the digital divide. We have to make sure that all kids have devices, and that means every kid in the household needs a device that they can work on at the same time for their schoolwork. It's not one device in the house. There are 3 kids. It's 3 devices, so everybody's working.
Yeah.
They have to have internet access, and that doesn't mean just that there's the availability of bandwidth. It means they, in their home, have to be able to access the internet, and that may mean we have to get them a Wi-Fi hotspot, or we have to work out something with the cable company where they waive the unpaid balance, but we got to have them with the device and the internet. Then we got to make sure that learning is really good and engaging and interesting and compelling. And I worry that some of the more resource districts that were already doing stuff around ed technology already had teachers who had received professional development around how to integrate technology. They were just much differently prepared than the districts that weren't doing those things. And just say, hey, here's how you log into Zoom is not enough to make compelling online instruction that takes advantage of some of the education technology tools to make learning compelling. It has students, and that's what we're seeing as you look across the country, right? That you got to make, just like regular class in person, you got to make it good. Kids have to feel excited about what they're learning. We have to, there's opportunities to build in video, to build in hands-on projects, to mix the, the asynchronous delivery of some content with synchronous interaction where you're supporting students' work on projects or their work on activities or discussing the text. But there are ways to do distance learning well. We got to figure that out, both for this period, but given the evolution of the pandemic, likely for periods next school year. So we got to get that right. We're going to need resources, and Congress and states are going to have to step up in terms of resources so that districts can not only avoid cuts, but actually put additional resources towards summer learning, extended day learning, summer 21 learning, intensive tutoring, maybe with teachers, maybe with AmeriCorps volunteers through City Year. But we got to figure out a strategy to get students the support they need to close that learning loss gap, particularly our most vulnerable, and we got to have a strategy around socio-emotional and mental health supports. Some kids are home with 2 parents who are teleworking. It's challenging. They're juggling a lot, but they're able to support their kids' learning. Other kids are in homes where maybe the parents aren't home. Only 20% of the African American workforce can work from home. Or maybe they're in a home where there's domestic violence or addiction
Mm-hmm.
or abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And so this missed period of school is compounding their trauma and their
Mm-hmm.
emotional stress that they've been under. And so we're going to need to address that when kids come back.
Mm-hmm. Sobering view of just how much we have to get right all at the same time. Thank you so much for spending some time with us as part of this Rethinking Intervention series, and we look forward to continuing to learn from all the work you all are doing at EdTrust in shaping the way we think about how to help students moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks for what you're doing at Instruction Partners to get in there side by side with districts, with principals, with teachers to figure out how to advance equity.
Thank you.